So firstly, we have training where we need to make sure that that's in place. That's because this is the reason for the body to evolve into this recomposition phase. If we don't train the body being a lazy piece of fecal matter, it will just stay where it is and it won't have any drive to be building muscle tissue. This is the My Vegan Personal Trainer podcast with Remy, episode 4.
Welcome to the My Vegan Personal Trainer podcast, where it's all about living a fit, plant-based lifestyle so you can thrive in life while caring for the planet and animals. And now, your host, medical doctor, CrossFit athlete, and online personal trainer, Remy.
Hey, it's Remy. Welcome to the episode number 4 of the My Vegan Personal Trainer podcast. When applicants to our coaching program get to describe what their goal is, what they want help with, then in 99% of cases, there it's written build muscle, lose fat. Formulated in one way or the other, but that's basically what the goal is. And therefore, I thought, why not have an episode already from the beginning of the podcast that addresses this exact goal. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about body recomposition, basically building muscle, losing fat at the same time. The ins and outs, I'll give a fairly detailed breakdown in terms of how to make this happen in an as effective fashion as possible. And at the end of the episode, I will also be sharing some resources which you can further visit if you really want to get even more nuances put on top and get even more detail with things. And probably the most valuable thing by the end of this episode, after going through a more detailed breakthrough of how to do it, I'll also be giving some super simple steps, super simple guidelines that you can use to make this happen for you as well, without going in all the details. So basically using the 80-20 principle to get ahead. Subscribe if you're not already a member of the tribe. And before we get into the meat of the conversation, let's just start with a boring disclaimer, which is the information provided in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not meant to take the place of professional medical, dietetic, or fitness advice. Consult with a relevant professional for your specific situation. Now that out of the way, the weather prognosis today says 3 meters per second wind. It's going to be a bit cloudy, but when it comes to value in this episode, it's going to be something, if implemented, something that will move the needle for you. So I'm excited. Let's get into it. First, let's start by defining what is body recomposition. So the definition we'll be going by is that the body recomposition is where you are having a reduction in body fat percentage while increasing your lean body mass. And for this to happen, you can have two scenarios. So one is you are actually building more muscle mass while you are burning fat, while you're losing fat. That's one way. Another way is that you are actually maintaining your body fat mass, but you're increasing your lean body mass, you're increasing your muscle mass. And in this second scenario, even though the amount of fat you have on the body and the amount of adipose tissue you have, even though that's constant, the fact that we will be weighing more because now we are putting on muscle, and it will make the body fat percentage decrease automatically, as a normal consequence, as we are weighing more, and therefore the total fat mass in comparison to the total mass will be less. So now I'll just bring you down memory lane, back to the time when you were in physics class learning about laws of thermodynamics. We will revisit the first law of thermodynamics, which is energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be converted from one form into another. Based on this first law of thermodynamics, then we can falsely assume that, okay, to build muscle, we need to be in an energy surplus, and to lose fat, then we have to be in an energy deficit. In a way, to some extent, there is obviously truth to it. So if you're going on a full blown cut or a full-blown bulk, then you will be in a caloric surplus to build muscle, and you will be in a caloric deficit to lose fat if you are just focusing on one of these two. But because adipose tissue and muscle tissue, they are two different systems in our body, it is possible to actually be losing fat while we are gaining muscle mass. So I just want to put this out here, just create some background, because sometimes we can bump into information that says that, okay, if you want to build muscle, you have to be in a surplus, and if you want to lose fat, then you have to be in a deficit. But it's not that black and white. There is a lot of nuance to it. Again, the human body is a complex, beautiful mess. So just want to address that it is actually possible for this to happen, and it's actually possible to make recomposition happen for most individuals. Only a small group of trainers will have a very hard time at achieving body recomposition, if any, and those are advanced trainees where they already have everything dialed in when it comes to their training, nutrition, recovery. But even though it is possible for most to achieve recomposition, obviously there are groups where it's the likelihood of achieving successful recomposition is much higher compared to others. And to put it in a simple way, then the more fat mass you have on your body, the more adipose tissue you have, and the less training experience you have, the better are your chances at body recomposition. So the common scenarios where body recomposition success is of high likelihood all the following. So, firstly, you have the new lifters if you're totally new to resistance training, where your muscle building potential is at the highest it ever will be in your lifting career, where fat can be used to fuel the muscle building process. Secondly, we have overweight or obese trainees, where you have excess adipose tissue that can be used to fuel the muscle building process. Thirdly, we have detrained individuals, so individuals who before were having a good routine training, but then fell off the wagon and first later on would then come back and get back to it. This type of situation is similar to a new trainee in terms of the potential for recomposition because of this muscle memory effect, where you might have tried it yourself at one point, or maybe if you know someone where they've been off gym for a long time, they get back and pretty soon they are almost where they left off. Another fourth group, we have individuals using anabolic steroids. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, okay, I'm not a new lifter. I've been lifting for quite some years now. I'm in the gym. I'm not overweight or obese. I'm not detrained. I'm going to it more or less regularly, and I'm not using steroids. So that means body recomposition might not make sense for me. But if your training is not optimal, you've just been showing up, doing a little bit of work here and there, but nothing serious, and also if your nutrition has not really been dialed in, then there is a very high likelihood that you could basically just continue yourself as a new lifter, as a novice, and as a novice, we can define a novice as being someone who can on a weekly basis be pushing the weights, progressing on the lifts from week to week, basically. If you're able to do that, or still, even though you've been going for the gym for 5 years or more, or I don't know, it doesn't matter how many years, but if you're been doing that on a regular basis and you're still there, then you can consider yourself a new lifter, and you definitely have great potential of achieving successful recomposition. For this podcast episode, since most of listeners to this podcast will be new lifters, overweight slash obese, or detrained, therefore those are the individuals I'll be focusing on for this episode. Doesn't mean that you can't achieve body recomposition when you're more advanced. You definitely can, but it does require a higher attention to details. And since most of you won't be advanced based on the data I have so far, I'll be focusing on new lifters, overweight or obese trainees, and detrained individuals, which basically can be considered as new lifters. In terms of body recomposition, the amazing thing when it comes to being a new trainee or being overweight slash obese is that it's actually very realistic to achieve body recomposition. It's much easier compared to if you're more advanced, where for you to then achieve success in terms of body recomposition, it will require a much greater attention to details and to many more variables than what is required for you. And in terms of body recomposition for an advanced trainee, the level of attention to detail is actually even higher compared to if that individual was to just focus on going on a cut or bulking. Topics that we will be covering in the future episodes to come. Even though body recomposition is possible even for more advanced trainees, at one point for most lifters, then it does make sense after a period of recomposition for someone who is new, obese, overweight, or detrained. Then for most people, it can make sense to either choose between a purely fat loss focus phase or muscle gaining phase, because as you're getting more advanced, it is harder to manage body recomposition and to stay motivated, and progress can also be hard to measure. So therefore, choosing either between a fat loss or muscle gain phase later, once recomposition might not be as favored as compared to the demographics I've just mentioned. But do note I said for most, and this should not come to demotivate a more advanced trainee to go for it. You can definitely go for it. Just know that you need to be paying attention to many more variables and to be more detail oriented for you to achieve success with body recomposition. So before we start our body recomposition journey, our body recomposition adventure, it's important that you gain some tools from this episode so that you can use to assess whether you are where you need to be, whether you need to make any course corrections as you are protruding forward in this arena. Because if we don't have a compass and a map to use when we out in no man's land, we will get lost. It's hard to know where we are. It's hard to know where we need to be at, and it's hard to keep us motivated, and it will just not make any sense to us. So if you're serious about this whole body recomposition goal, here are all the tools that I would recommend you use. First tool that we need is something that will help guide us get an idea of where we are at body fat percentage wise. This is something we'll be needing in as part of setting up our nutrition, and I'll get to that in a bit. And because due to the inaccuracies we have tied to the currently available ways of measuring body fat percentage, then I would just not recommend you do that on an individual level. Instead, I would suggest just assess it with a visual guide that I'll be linking to in the show notes, where you can get an idea on where you are more or less in terms of body fat percentage, whether you are male or female. So do check that out in the show notes. Next tool is the body weight scale, where I recommend you weigh yourself on a daily basis and take a weekly average. And as you move from week to week, you will be having those weekly averages to help you see a trend in your body weight progression. And the reason why I would recommend a weekly average is due to the fluctuations that you will be experiencing from day to day when doing your body weight scale measurements. So it basically smooths out the development you'll be having in your weekly data points. And therefore, it will be easier to see the trend that you are establishing. It's important that you standardize the way you are measuring your body weight. I would recommend you do this first thing in the morning, fasted after having been to the toilet, standing on the same scale, wearing the same stuff. So basically, taking a bit of a scientific approach where like you're in a laboratory and you just want to standardize everything as much as possible so the results that you are getting are reliable, comparable. The next tool that I recommend you use is a piece of measuring tape to take body circumference measurements for the extremities, making sure you include the upper arms and the thighs without forgetting circumference measurement at your waist. The one at the waist level is actually very important. It's a great indication that you are losing fat if it's going down. So do make sure to include those, and you can definitely take all the places as well if you fancy. I can recommend you do it on a weekly basis so that we have something to couple up with our weekly body weight. It's not a must to do it on a weekly basis. It does take time, obviously. So if you feel it doesn't provide you that much value, having it paired up with your weekly body weight, then you can also just do it every 2 to 4 weeks instead. And I would suggest you are fairly meticulous in terms of taking these circumference measurements so that you make sure that you are able to track even smaller body changes by making sure that you include the smallest increment possible to measure. So on a centimeter measuring tape to the nearest zero point 0.1 centimeter. And just like with the body weight measurement, make sure you standardize the way you are taking your body circumference measurements such that you are, when it comes to the extremities, taking it at the widest points. And if you are tensing or not, make sure that that's consistent every time you are to take the measurements. Just like with the body weight measurement, it's important to standardize the way you are taking those body circumference measurements. So, preferably doing it in the morning, fasted after having been to the toilet, and making sure that you are taking the measurements at the same places and in the same way, basically, such that the result we are producing is something we can rely on. Next tracking tool will be your phone, which you'll be using to take progress photos once a month, where you will be taking all of your body from the front, the side, and the back. Again, making sure you standardize the way you're taking the photos, so using the same camera, preferably taking it yourself with a self timer to the camera, same time of the day with the same lighting, same camera. Maybe I already said same camera, but you know what I mean. So basically, standardize as much as possible so that it's more comparable, the photo that you'll be getting from month to month. So far we've been through 4 tools. The fifth tool that I recommend is getting a logbook, either a physical one or an electronic one when it comes to your gym performance, where you can actually log your training, where you can log how many sets you're doing, the amount of reps and the weight, and also the if you're working with RPE, rating the RPE for that lift. But most important, just write what you're doing so that you have something to compare next time you are to do the same workout, and therefore you have something to remind you, okay, this is something, either we maintain it or we strive, rather obviously try to see if we can beat what we did last time, either by having more load or by having more reps, making things feel easier. Because without a logbook, some of the numbers is something you can remember, but sometimes you also, there can be a recall bias, such which where I mean that you basically think, oh, that was the weight I had last time, but that was maybe some weight you had a few more weeks back, and therefore you might stall your progress compared to if you have the real numbers that you had last time and you strive on really pushing those numbers, especially again if you are a novice trainee who which by definition is someone who can progress on a week to week basis for most lifts. And you might be using apps where you are typing in your data. Again, it's better than not doing it at all, but just be aware that again, apps that change, maybe you'll want to change to another app, and it can be a bit hard to then keep having this data as you move from app to app. So my best recommendation is either have a physical notebook with you in gym, or have, this is what I use, having an electronic one. I use Evernote, where I basically type in what I'm doing. So get something that you can have for a long time, so that let's say 5-10 years down the line you can look back and assess what you were doing. Maybe you can get some gems out of that data and improve your current training. Last tools I have will be regarding nutrition, where we'll be needing a food scale and a nutrition tracking app. The food scale, preferably a digital one. The nutrition tracking app can be there are free ones like MyFitnessPal. Most of you have probably heard of it. You can also get something called the chronometer, and you also have this last one is a premium paid one called Macro Factor. I'm not affiliated with any of those. They are just some that I know of and have used before, and you can definitely go for these. In terms of weighing your food, I would recommend you go for the raw weight rather than the cooked weight, as through the process of cooking, again, you get water into the product, and it can vary how what the final weight will be from time to time you will be using it. So go for the raw weight to the extent possible to be a bit more accurate. The two most important things to be aware of when you are tracking your food with a nutrition tracking app is to pay attention to the protein and the calories as a minimum. It's typically not that hard to hit our carbs and fats, but more challenging for most to make sure that we get up to those protein requirements that I'll be presenting to you later, and also to remain within the daily caloric budget. In terms of accuracy when tracking your nutrition, then I recommend a range of plus minus 100 calories for your calories, plus minus 10 grams for your carbs and protein, and plus minus 5 grams for your fats. So you can view yourself as an artist. An artist has paint, brushes, and all kind of equipment that's used to create this bigger picture. So this bigger picture will be painted by the tools that I have mentioned. And I would recommend every 2 to 4 weeks that you would then be looking at this bigger picture painted by this orchestra of tracking tools. It's only by looking at this bigger picture rather than individual data points that you will be making judgment whether you are on track and making progress, or if that's not the case and you need to make some adjustment. If the bigger picture says that, yeah, we are progressing, then no need to change anything. As long as you can see things are moving in the right direction, stay patient. This is a slow process, and as long as we can see things are moving forward, just keep going. The following are signs of progress. So if you are getting stronger in the gym, you are visually you can just see that you are looking better from the one progress photo to the next. If your waist circumference measurement is going down, and if you can see the other body circumference measurements at your extremities, you can see those going up, although not necessarily, they don't necessarily have to go up. In the beginning, it could also be that you'll be losing more fat mass and building in those areas. But if you also see those increasing together with the waist circumference decreasing, that's a very good sign that we are building muscle and losing fat at the same time. And do note that among the signs of progress, I didn't mention body weight. It may or may not change, and it will be dependent on how many calories you are having and also just your standpoint. Next, we'll get into adjustment of our training and our nutrition protocol, depending on what feedback we're getting from our tracking tools. But before we get to adjusting our current course, it's just important that we are patient in this process and we are focused on the process, that we strive to be as compliant as we can be to the process. And what the actual process entails will be revealed further down in this episode. It's just important that's the main focus, rather than being trigger happy to be always changing your calories, macros, making assessments way too often, and not trusting where you are and being impatient. Rather than being too obsessed over how you look in the mirror, the best investment you can do for yourself is to be more focused on working hard and smart in the gym, making sure your sleep is in place, and striving to get to the point where you enjoy the process rather than being too result focused. Because if you're always thinking, okay, am I there yet, am I there yet, it will just take, not only will it take a lot of the joy out of the current process, but you will also lose focus on what you actually need to be doing right now, which is to be having your hands on the steering wheel and just take one step at a time, rather than constantly checking your map and seeing, am I there yet, or how many kilometers are there yet, how many miles are left, rather than just staying in the now, being focused on, okay, what should we be doing right now? Is it assessment day to day? No. Well, we forget everything about analyzing and evaluating the process right now. We just need to stay in the process, do the work, forget everything about the end goal. Now, let's say you are making an assessment and it is some time ago, 2, 3 weeks ago, and you can actually see that the big picture is pointing in the direction of us not losing fat or gaining muscle. Before jumping to conclusions that, okay, we need to make some adjustments to the current plan, first try to reflect over how the last couple of weeks have gone. Have you been consistent? How has your sleep been? How has your compliance been to adhering to the daily caloric numbers? How has your protein intake been from day to day? And in your gym, how is it going there? Are you pushing the weight? Are you getting stronger? Now, let's say you have been checking the box with quality on a day to day basis, being full compliant to the process, and the bigger picture painted by our tracking tools is pointing towards that we are not making progress. Whether the goal was primarily to lose fat or build muscle in this recomposition process, we might want to adjust the calories by 100 to 500 calories, depending on if it's smaller to bigger changes we want to make to the current caloric plan. And those calories should be coming from carbs and or fats. And when it comes to fats, it's just important that we stay within the range that will be recommended later, and don't go below the lowest number in that range for fats. But more on that in a bit. When it comes to the body recomposition goal, where you are more lean towards losing fat, and you can see that's not happening, apart from just adjusting with calories. Let's say you don't want to go lower with your current daily caloric intake, although it should be underlined that you want to view nutrition as what will be creating the deficit in general. But if let's say we are in a situation where you don't want to go lower with your calories, then the alternative could be to then add more activity or cardio. So activity could be just being taking the stairs, walking to school, to work. More about cardio later in this episode. When it comes to long-term adjustment, obviously you will be adjusting the process as you will be switching goals. And also, if during this recomposition phase you will be in a caloric deficit, more about calories in a bit during this episode, but if you will be in a caloric deficit for a longer time period, for more than 3 months, then it can be highly recommended that you apply diet breaks every 12 weeks in the time period you are in a deficit. The diet break should last 1 to 2 weeks, and the purpose of having one is primarily for psychological reasons. Being in a deficit for a long time, it can take a toll on you mentally. So, for us to take a little mental break, that's why we have those diet breaks, so that after that break, we can then go back fresh mentally and ready to keep pushing forward. If having a diet break every 12 weeks is something you feel is just too long before that diet break will be happening, then you can take it more often, say about those 8 weeks. So some of you listening to this might think this is a bit counterproductive, going on a diet break when I just gain weight again and go back to where I started. Does this even make sense? Maybe a little anxiety has kicked in, but there's no need to worry about gaining fat. You will, as you having this diet break, I will get to the details just in a bit, but as you are going in a diet break, you will be you will gain weight on the scale, but most of it will be gone again once you're back to the deficit. It's only a very minimal part of that weight gain which will be fat, and you will be well on your way once you are out of this diet break. A simple way of doing a diet break is basically keep your same meal timings, the same time you normally have your meals, keep those, and just don't track your nutrition, and just eat till you're not hungry. Rely on your feeling of satiety, and don't worry about gaining fat. And when it comes to training, you just keep showing up to the gym. No change needed for that part. By eating till you're not hungry, not counting, not worrying, your calories will very likely be higher than they normally are. You will be more at around maintenance, and once you are off this diet break, you just go back to the caloric deficit again and take it from there. Now, after having gone past the introductory topics for this episode, it's now time to actually go into the meat of the conversation, which is, okay, how do we actually get this going? How do we recomp? So, before we get into the trenches and get into more detail about the macros, the calories, and everything, then I really want to spend some time on really emphasizing what is the most important thing to focus on if you are to go for the goal of recomposition, especially since this podcast will be listened to by primarily novice trainees new to the gym who might be obese or overweight. Therefore, the most important thing to focus on when it comes to recomp is that we should get training in check. To be honest, like, you can even almost pretty much just ignore nutrition in the beginning and just focus on training. Training, you should view it basically as the reason for why the body will be going through a recomposition. So without training, no recomposition, to put it simply. Nutrition does enhance this recomposition process, and actually to a great degree, but without training, the body is not forced into building muscle. So let's say you're in a situation, you are totally new to the gym, to resistance training. You don't really have any routine when it comes to training yet, and nutrition, all that stuff. It's so new that it just feels overwhelming that you have to be taking care of all those variables. If that's you, and you feel that you don't have that many resources in terms of time and mental space right now to be taking care of everything at once, then the most important thing to take away from this episode, and this will apply to most listeners actually, it is to fall in love with the process of training, the feeling you have after training, making sure that you are performing your exercises with good technique, full range of motion, where your sets, they are near failure sets, so you're not leaving too many reps in the tank, but pushing to near failure in your sets, and making sure that you are pushing the load, pushing your performance from week to week. So this is where a training log can be very handy, and making sure that you are training your body parts at least twice per week, having 10 to 20 sets per body part per week. If you are in the novice category, you want to be in the lower end of that range. And when it comes to rest times between sets, make sure that you're resting enough between sets such that your performance in the next one, it won't be that much different compared to the last set you just did. So if you go from a set where you just were able to do 10 reps, next one you were only able to do 4 or 5, that's a good indicator that you might have taken too short a rest time between. Lastly, when it comes to the tempo to your lifts, a good way of approaching this is to be focusing on being explosive in the concentric phase, being the phase where your muscle is contracting, being the phase where you're working against gravity, to basically picking a load up, and in the eccentric phase, which is the opposite phase, so the muscle lengthening phase, the phase where your muscle are lengthening under tension with gravity, there you want to focus on the tempo being controlled. Not overly slow, but just controlled, getting it back from where you started, and then you're ready to explode again into the next rep. In alignment with the 80-20 principle, if you're obese, overweight, or a new trainee, just focus on training for 6 to 12 months and make sure that your technique is proper, that you're pushing the weights properly, that you have a well-designed program for you, so you're training smart and hard. And when it comes to nutrition, just eat around maintenance. Don't worry much about it. And for your all your meal meals, make sure that you have a substantial protein source for each meal. Don't worry too much about the exact amount of grams you have per meal in the beginning. Just focus on having protein rich sources identifiable in each meal, and make sure it's a variety of protein source that you're using. So not just relying on one protein source, especially within the vegan realm, where it's important that we combine our protein sources in terms of attaining an optimal amino acid profile for muscle building. And you can refer back to episode number 3 with Dr. Anastasia Zinchenko, where we went through the details when it came to hitting your protein as a vegan athlete. You've got foods like tofu, tempeh, textured vegetable protein, soy milks, protein powders, seitan, just to mention a handful of protein-rich vegan sources. As most of you have a busy life, it's not only training and nutrition, but you have so many other balls in the air. So this is at least how I recommend you start approaching recomposition in the beginning. And for those who maybe feel that, okay, they just want to get everything dialed in from the beginning, they have more time and more mental space to really just focus on more variables already from the start, then this next more in-depth approach will be for you. This more in-depth approach will be outlined with 4 steps. First step being training, second step being focusing on getting the right caloric intake dialed in. Thirdly, being setting up the right macros, so basically your protein, your carbohydrates, fats. And fourthly is a bonus box where we most of the variables there are not that crucial to nail in here in the beginning, but still relevant to just mention, so you know what else you can apply once you've gotten those first steps applied. So firstly, we have training, where we need to make sure that that's in place. That's because this is the reason for the body to evolve into this recomposition phase. If we don't if we don't train, the body, being a lazy piece of fecal matter, it will just stay where it is, and it won't have any drive to be building muscle tissue. So training must be in place, and I already mentioned the important specifics of training earlier in the episode, so I will just move on to step number 2, which will be now us entering the arena of nutrition. Although I have just expressed the massive importance that training has in terms of body recomposition, nutrition can significantly impact how you're performing in the gym, how you recover, and the end goal when it comes to body recomposition. It actually has a dramatic effect. If you have one scenario where you don't focus on it at all, at any point in the recomposition phase, compared to if you do take that variable seriously as well. In this part 2 of the more in-depth approach to body recomposition, we're going to focus on setting up your calories and taking a decision when it comes to what is most important. Is it fat loss, or is it muscle building, or is it both? It's generally best to choose between what's most important, whether it's building lean mass or losing fat, even though the goal with body recomposition is to achieve both. But the reason why it's important to have one focus point is because it can optimize your final body recomposition outcome. I'll just give some examples to further explain the concept of making a choice. Let's say you are an overweight, obese trainee with a lot of adipose tissue. Then for both health reasons and as well from an aesthetic perspective, it would typically make sense to focus on the fat loss phase being the more important goal. So this would mean that you would get into a caloric deficit leaning into the process of losing fat, but you will still be able to build muscle even though we are in this deficit. We're just focusing on the process of losing the excess adipose tissue rather than the muscle building process. In another example, let's say you are fairly lean, not so lean that you don't have any desire for fat loss, or else you wouldn't have any desire for body recomposition. But let's say you are fairly lean, and the part where you feel you're lacking the most is in terms of your muscle mass rather than the amount of fat you have on your body. In this situation, it will then make more sense to lean into a muscle building phase compared to the fat loss phase, such that the outcome of this body recomposition will be more in line with what you're going for. I'm well aware that this step of taking the decision whether fat loss or muscle building is more important does sound like you're sabotaging the whole purpose of body recomposition. In the situation where fat loss is the primary goal, there you would be in a caloric deficit. In the case where the goal is more on building muscle and that process, there it will be a caloric surplus you'll be in. And if you really can't choose between the one or the other, and you really find both are equally important, then just stay at caloric maintenance. So basically the amount of calories that will maintain your body weight. If you're currently on the leaner side, so for males about the 8 to 12% of body fat, which would correspond for females to be around the 18 to 22%, then the primary goal would be to build muscle typically. If body composition wise you are not that lean, you have more fat mass, so for males about 15 to 20% body fat percentage or more, for females about 25 to 30% or more, then the primary goal here would be to focus on losing fat typically. Again, though these are just guidelines, you can do whatever you want. Those are just in those cases that would typically make most sense for most people. As already mentioned, when the primary goal is to build muscle, you will then be in a caloric surplus. And if the primary goal is to lose fat, you will then be in a caloric deficit. But now comes the next part to it. So how big or small of a caloric surplus or deficit should we be in? That's the next part we'll focus on. And it will be dependent on your present body composition and your training experience. Before we go any further, we first need to estimate our maintenance calories, which is basically the number of calories you need per day to maintain your current body weight. This number is dependent on your weight, your height, your age, and your activity level. So if you've gone through a significant change in your body weight, it's been some years since you've been calculating this maintenance caloric number, or you have simply changed in terms of how active you are on a daily basis, then it can make sense to revisit the calculation of this number. A simple way of estimating your maintenance calories is simply by using calorie calculator, which you can find either by Googling or, since it's part of our tools, just using your nutrition tracking app. So MyFitnessPal, Chronometer, or MacroFactor, the ones that I've been mentioning. It could also be other ones. You have LiveSum, for example. But basically picking your nutrition tracking app and typing in your data, your details, and then from those, your calories. If you're in the case where your primary goal is to build muscle, then you want to be in a surplus, which is between 5 to 25% of the maintenance that is added on top of your maintenance calories. So maintenance, and on top of that, you have 5 to 25% of that maintenance that's added on top. The less experienced you are in the gym and the leaner you are, the higher you will be lying in this 5 to 25% range. When you're new to the gym, your muscle building potential is the highest it ever will be, and therefore you can easily go in a bigger surplus compared to if you were more advanced as a trainee, and you don't need to worry that much about fat mass. In the case where the primary goal is to lose fat mass, then you would be in a caloric deficit, which will be 10 to 20% below maintenance. So 10 to 20% of your maintenance would be deducted from your daily caloric maintenance number. And the more adipose tissue you have to lose, the higher your body fat percentage, the higher up in this 10 to 20% caloric deficit range you can put yourself in. If you're very high in body fat percentage, way beyond the ranges mentioned, way beyond 25% for men and 35% for women, way above those numbers, then it can definitely make sense to go even higher in your caloric deficit. So up to about 30% in caloric deficit. All right, so now we'll go to step 3 of this more in-depth outline of body recomposition. We will now be looking into the macronutrients. So your protein, your carbs, your fats. How should they look like? First, we will discuss the macronutrient protein. So the leaner we are, the more likely we are to lose muscle when we are in a caloric deficit due to less adipose tissue available for fuel. Therefore, it can be recommended to consume more protein the lower in body fat percentage we are, so that we can better hold on to the muscle mass we have and have better chances at building muscle mass when we are in a deficit.
This is why the authors of the book called The Ultimate Guide to Body Recomposition, a result that I've been leaning against as part of creating this podcast episode. It will be linked in the description, by the way. They recommend a sliding scale for determining your protein intake based on your body fat percentage. The lower end of the scale being 1.2 grams per pound of lean body mass, and the higher end of it being 1.6 grams per pound of lean body mass.
And for those who are not that familiar with the use of the unit pounds, then it would correspond to between 2.6 to 3.5 grams per kilo of lean body mass. If you're on the leaner side, you will be shooting for the higher end of this range, and if you have more body fat on your body to lose, then you would be on the lower end of this range. For males and females, if your body fat percentage is of single digit or near single digit, then you would shoot for the higher end of the range. And if your body fat percentage is on the higher end, so for males about the 30% or more, and females 40% or higher, then you would be going for the 1.2 grams per pound of lean body mass, corresponding to 2.6 grams per kilo of lean body mass. For you to figure out what your lean body mass is, you're going to be using the visual assessment that I have linked in the show notes. I already mentioned it among our tools. Actually, it was tool number 1, which you will be using to assess where you, obviously it's an estimation, but you'll be estimating where you are at right now, body fat percentage wise. Just to give a simple example, let's say you weigh 100 kilos and your body fat percentage, according to this visual assessment, is 20%. That would mean that 20% of your total body mass is body fat, which then leaves the rest being the lean body mass. So basically, it's 20% of those 100 kilos that is fat, and the rest being lean body mass. So in this case, your lean body mass would be 80 kilos. Another way of calculating your protein target is by simply multiplying your body mass by 2.4 gram per kilo body weight. And if you are obese or overweight, then multiply the 2.4 gram per kilo body weight by the body weight you would be at when your BMI is at the higher end in the normal range. If you haven't checked episode number 3 of the podcast, then do check that out so you can get a further understanding of how we got to the 2.4 gram per kilo body weight. So this number that I've been recommending, they are challengingly high for most. And before I will address how you can potentially address this situation, if it is a challenge, which I know it is for most of you listening, just based on experience, that's how it often is. But let's say it is easy for you to hit those numbers. You get to a point where it's manageable to hit those higher numbers. Based on the literature we have right now, if you are otherwise healthy, then in terms of body recomposition, then if you can get even higher than those numbers, it can potentially create even better body recomposition outcomes in terms of building more lean mass and losing more fat mass in the process. But most of you listening will not find this easy to hit. It's pretty high, and the mindset you should have going into hitting a protein should be the highest level of protein that you can sustain, and then you can start from there, and then over time you can strive to increase your protein intake. As I already mentioned before, just focus here at the beginning to make sure that you have a substantial amount of protein in each meal. And once you get to that point, then you can start focusing on, okay, how do I up my protein game even further? So you can basically take it step by step if you feel it's a bit overwhelming to get to this high level of protein from day one. But again, it's not impossible. You can definitely, from day one, get up to that level if you really want to. The most important thing here is basically knowing what sources, what foods to use to spike up protein levels. I've already mentioned a handful of them, and you can also just Google high protein, rich vegan sources, and you also get some there. But just setting up the right infrastructure nutritionally that will support high protein on a consistent basis, basically having a system, you know which foods to use and where to buy them and how to make those meals delicious so that it's not something that will be a struggle every day. This was also addressed in episode number 3 with Dr. Anastasia Zinchenko, but I will just mention it here as well. So in terms of optimizing your amino acid profile, now that we are operating in the vegan realm, make sure that about 50% of your protein sources are coming from legumes and the other 50% coming from grains. So you can more or less get an amino acid profile that is more supportive of muscle building. In order for you to get the most out of your daily protein intake, then it can be recommended that you more or less evenly distribute your protein across 3 or more meals with about 3 to 5 hours between each meal. So that was our popular macronutrient protein. Now we'll go on to the next one, and that will be fat. And right after talking about fat, then we'll go into carbohydrates, which is our last macro that will be contributing to the total caloric pie. And since carbs is the last one of the fats, that means if we are going high fat, then automatically carbs will be lower because, again, we are limited by the calories we've already set. You want to keep your fat intake between 20 to 35% of your total calories and making sure that you never go below the 20% as it can negatively impact your health. Now, where we'll be setting our fat intake, so between this 20 to 35 range, will be dependent on our body fat percentage, our personal preference, and our activity level. When it comes to body fat percentage, there is a strong relationship between body fat percentage and insulin resistance, such that the higher your body fat percentage, the lower your insulin sensitivity, meaning your ability to efficiently utilize carbohydrates is impeded the more body fat you carry on your body. Therefore, if your body fat percentage is on the higher end, it can therefore be recommended that you have your fat intake on the higher end of this 20 to 35% of total calories, so that you keep your carb intake on the lower end. So for males, if your body fat percentage is at about 25% or more, then you'll be shooting for about those 35% of your total calories coming from fats. And if your body fat percentage is on the lower end, so single digit numbers, then you would be aiming for those about 20% of total calories coming from fats. For females, if your body fat percentage is about 40% or more, that's where you will be around the 35% of your total calories coming from fats. And if your body fat percentage is on the lower end, being about 10%, then you would be at the 20% of total calories coming from fats. Those are the extremes to the ranges, and if you are anything in between, then adjust your percentage of your dietary fat accordingly. Other than body fat percentage, your activity level also has a say in terms of what your dietary fat should be at. The more active a lifestyle you lead, the more carbs you can have in your nutrition, as you will be better at using carbohydrates for energy. And if you are more sedentary, you're not very active in your day-to-day life, then it does make sense to have a lower carb and to be higher when it comes to your dietary fat. Thirdly, we have personal preference that also has a say when it comes to how we should be setting up our fats and carbs. So if you know that you just function better on higher fats, go for that. Or lower, go for that. Those numbers that I'm presenting here are not all set in stone, it's just guidelines, so do keep that in mind. So that was dietary fat. So now we've set our calories, we've set our protein, our fats, so what's left will be carbs. So whatever is left calorie-wise in our budget will now be attributed to carbohydrates, as previously mentioned. But your carb intake doesn't have to be fixed across all days in a week. You can definitely have some days where you're having more calories from more carbohydrates than you would have on other days. So on a day where you are very active, there it could make sense to increase your carb intake, have more calories that day, and then on other days where you will be less active, have less calories, as you won't be spending as much energy. The most important thing is just to adhere to the weekly caloric goal, which you can determine by basically multiplying your daily caloric intake, which we have estimated before in this episode, multiply that number with 7, and then you get your estimated weekly caloric goal, just making sure that you stick to that budget, and then whether some days within that week are higher or lower, that's totally fine, as long as you just make sure that at the end of the week, the weekly caloric goal is adhered to. So we're now done talking about macros. So far we've talked about training, establishing, okay, this is very important in terms of pushing the body to build muscle. And next we've focused on setting up the calories. Thirdly, the macros, which we just completed right now. Now, fourth and final will be a bonus section. In this bonus section, I will be briefly mentioning some variables, and lastly then go a little bit more in depth with cardiovascular activity. So first up, we have sleep. I don't think I need to say more. Obviously, we all know sleep is important. So get your sleep. Strive to get your sleep hygiene in place. Next variable we have is supplementation. In most cases, supplements are not really necessary, although in the vegan realm, it can be actually very important to be supplementing with some products. I won't spend too much time on that in this episode. It's beyond the scope of it, but check out the free How to Go Vegan ebook that we provide when you sign up for our newsletter, where you basically have a full breakdown of supplements that I recommend, and also blood tests if that's something you are interested in taking. And don't worry, I don't spam you in this newsletter. It's only when we have something valuable to come out with that we publish there, but you can definitely just subscribe, get it, and then unsubscribe if you really are not into emails, so no pressure there. Next variable is going to be peri-workout nutrition. So basically the nutrition you're having in relation to your workout, so right before, during, and after working out, what are you having there? I'm just going to leave it here and just mention that this is some variable that you can look into later down the road. But again, this episode is addressed to mainly new lifters. And when you are new, this is a variable that is not very important. It's much more important that you get the fundamentals in place before you start worrying too much about peri-workout nutrition. But I'm just going to mention it here. So at one point, when you do have everything in place, then that is the next thing that you could potentially look at. Final topic that we'll be covering today will be cardio. So when we are chasing body recomposition, does cardio have a place in this process? If yes, how much can we do? How do we do it? When do we do it? All those questions, we will be getting to that.
But first, it's important that we remind ourselves what does what in the process of body recomposition. So a properly structured training program and having enough protein intake will be responsible primarily for the part of building muscle. And being in a caloric deficit will be the driver for fat loss. Now, even though cardio does burn calories, it shouldn't be considered as the main tool for creating a caloric deficit. And that's because compared to the use of nutrition as the main tool for driving a deficit, it is much less efficient. It's tied with the potential of interference between cardio and resistance training. Plus, it also creates a greater demand in terms of recovery for the body. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place. There are obviously situations where it's not sustainable for someone to go lower in their calories with their nutrition, where cardio then can come to play. Plus, there is this great benefit of cardiovascular health when we're doing cardio. So, takeaway should be that when body recomposition is a primary goal, to be performing cardio at an effective minimum. Whether your cardio will work against resistance training will be dependent on how often you're doing the cardio, at what intensity you're doing it, and certainly whether the exercises you're using for your cardio are high impact or low impact. Just to give some examples, so running on asphalt, for example, being high impact cardio activity compared to swimming or biking being low impact cardio activities, being less taxing for the joints. So you would therefore be choosing low impact over high impact cardio activities to minimize the interference that it can have with resistance training. When it comes to the frequency, so how often you ought to do cardio, then it would be anything between 0 to about 5 sessions per week. And what that number will be specifically for you will be dependent on how much fat you have to lose and on your lifestyle, whether it's a more sedentary one or a more active one that you're leading. Whether more body fat you have on your body to lose or the more sedentary you are in your lifestyle, the more often it would make sense to do cardio in a week. So just as an example, let's say your job is physically demanding. It could be you work as a waiter, or it's in construction, or somewhere where you're getting many steps in per day. So not your classic office job where you're sitting on your butt all day long. If you are to add cardio here, if any, it would be on the lower end of the range that I just mentioned. As it will likely work against our muscle building process, and you need to use the energy you do have left from your job to be focusing that on resistance training. When it comes to intensity of the cardio we are doing, when focusing on the goal of body recomposition, it's relevant to look at the following two groups. So you have LIS and you have HIT. LIS short for low intensity steady state, and HIT, HIIT, being short for high intensity interval training. HIT sessions consist of short intervals of high effort between which there are longer breaks with a much lower working intensity. So just as an example, for a session, it could be 30 seconds all-out sprint on a bike, after which you'll be having 1 minute of rest, where it's just slow pedaling. And then you would be repeating this for like 8 times. These sessions will be performed, as the name also implies, at a steady state, so continuously at a low intensity compared to HIT and with no rest intervals. The classic example of a LIS session would be a trainee walking at brisk pace on a treadmill at incline for half an hour or more. If you walk into most commercial gyms, you'll almost be sure you will find at least one doing this type of cardio. When it comes to HIT compared to LIS, then although it is a bit more time efficient, more exciting, and it does help someone to actually push their limits, then performing HIT too often can impede our progress when it comes to building muscle. So therefore, it's best to limit your HIT cardio to 1 to 2 sessions max per week if you're planning to do it, and then have the rest of your planned cardio sessions being LIS. When it comes to timing of your cardio sessions, then do it when it fits in your schedule. Just most important is that you don't do it right before starting to do resistance training. As an example, it's some years ago, but I just had been to a pretty intense spinning class, and right after that session, I went into doing resistance training, and I could
my strength levels had just gotten down by a substantial amount. And that was the end of this more in-depth approach to body recomposition. Before we end today's episode, I will be now sharing the simplest and most effective strategy that will work for most of you listening today. As promised in the beginning of the episode, I would give an approach to body recomposition that would be taking the 80-20 principle into consideration, such that you might not be focusing on all those variables that I've been talking about to the same level of detail, but you are just focusing on few things that will yield the most and will be the best investment for you long term in terms of achieving long-term fitness success. And I've already given a hint about it during the episode, but here we have it again, and that is to just focus on training, and that's it. And if you have a little wiggle room, mental space-wise, then just for your main meals, just make sure you have an identifiable, substantial protein source for each meal. That's it. So making sure it's good quality training, get a program that fits you and your goal. This is something I help with for clients. You can also just Google is your friends. There are many great programs you can find for free online. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Making sure that you lean more into performance and just getting stronger in the gym and falling in love with that process. It will automatically just motivate you to start looking into those other areas. So let's say you have 6 months or more where you just focus on training, then over time you just a couple of months, maybe even the beginning, then you start becoming more and more motivated to also eating healthier. So the reason why I'm saying just focus on training and that's it basically is because you all the other things start to fall in place. You have heard of this episode now, so once you've got a good routine with training, your motivation levels are increasing, you can see it's actually working, you just want more, you can then just always get back to this episode and then start implementing those details that I've been sharing in the episode here. That's basically the best trick to body recomposition, such that you don't have to, again, mentally force yourself to implement everything at once. If you do have the time and results for it, go ahead, you can definitely do it. But for most where everything is new, you are busy with school or work or whatever it might be that you're doing in life, just focusing on training is the best investment long term. So I hope now you have not prepared your rotten tomatoes or something like that to throw at me right now, because you've just spent an whole hour just to hear that, okay, just focus on training. But yes, I think you know where it comes from. It comes from a place of practicality and with your best interest in mind. So that's pretty much it. All the resources I've been mentioning during the episode will be linked in the show notes, especially shout out to the book called The Ultimate Guide to Body Recomposition, How to Build Muscle and Lose Fat at the Same Time by the authors Jeff Nippert and Chris Barakat. I've been leaning myself against this valuable resource as part of making this episode. I'm not affiliated with them, but it's great content, and I will also be linking their book in the show notes so you can grab it if you're interested in getting even more nuances when it comes to the topic of body recomposition and want to get into more details. If you have any questions, comments, or any wishes for future episodes, then do feel free to contact us either via our website, www.myveganpersonaltrainer.com, or socials at myveganpersonaltrainer. You can find us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, everywhere almost. If you have not already, make sure to subscribe to the show. Next episode, we will be interviewing Kuntal Joycer, based in India, Mumbai, who stands behind the world's first ever fully vegan summit of Mount Everest. All right, that's pretty much it. Take care. Have a good one. Change your mindset. Change your life.
Thanks for listening to the My Vegan Personal Trainer podcast with Rami at www.myveganpersonaltrainer.com.